Okay, let's dive right into this. Welcome to The Explainer. I'm bringing my deep dive consulting background to the table today for a microanalysis of a fascinating yet incredibly complex system, the California Shelter Transfer Pipeline. Now, to make sure we hit every single angle on this, I recently sat down for a massive discussion with canine behavioralist Host B and Paul Miller, who is a canine legal expert and dog trainer over at Bay Canine. We completely dissected this pipeline layer by layer, looking at the legal frameworks and where things can potentially go off the rails, and I'm going to walk you through exactly what we uncovered.
Here is the executive schematic for our pipeline audit today. We're going to start with the agency dog pipeline itself, move into the statutory blueprint and exemptions, map out the fraud spectrum, examine a real-world pipeline rupture with the Miranda's rescue case, and finally, equip you with a red flag screening framework. We are mapping the flow all the way from perfectly legitimate shelter practices down to some pretty serious systemic vulnerabilities.
All right, Section 1, the agency dog pipeline. So what is this pipeline? Well, as Host B always reminds us, from a behavioral standpoint, we're talking about the actual physical movement of stressed dogs from shelters to rescues. But for today's microanalysis, we have to look closely at the structural pipes they're moving through. Paul Miller really anchored our discussion using the expansion module you see here from Bay Canine Consulting. We're focusing squarely on the legal spectrum. We're talking legitimate practices, those tricky regulatory gray zones, and outright fraud patterns.
Moving right along to Section 2, statutory blueprints and exemptions. Let's look at the laws governing this whole thing.
Before we can identify leaks in the system, we got to map the actual legal pipes and connectors. Paul hammered this point home for us. The absolute bedrock of this pipeline is Hayden's Law from 1998. Basically, it requires that any shelter intending to euthanize an animal must instead transfer it to a requesting 501c3 rescue. It's essentially a legally mandated detour from euthanasia. Hospi pointed out how massive this is in practice because it effectively forces a valve open, giving rescues the legal power to swoop in and literally save lives off the euthanasia list.
So here's how a dog flows through a fully compliant pipeline. It starts at Step 1 with the shelter's euthanasia list. Step 2 is the cooperative agreement. That's the formal contract between the shelter and the rescue. Under this agreement, a pull fee is paid, which Hayden's Law actually legally caps so it can't exceed a standard retail adoption fee. Step 3 is the shelter's formalized rescue partner program, which designates exactly who can pull animals. And finally, Step 4 is the transport or placement.
Now here's where Paul and I really got into a back-and-forth debate during our deep dive. I played devil's advocate and asked, does just having a 501c3 nonprofit status give a rescue blanket legal immunity? Well, Paul clarified that it absolutely does not. Take a look at the two prongs for the AB 519 exemption. You must have that nonprofit status, and you cannot obtain animals by paying breeders or brokers. Period. If a rescue pays a breeder, they are completely disqualified from that statutory rescue exemption. It's a critical legal connector that gets overlooked all the time.
Let's move to Section 3, mapping the fraud spectrum. It's time to map the system leaks.
This is where the behavioral, consulting, and legal frameworks really collide. We're analyzing the pressure levels of our pipeline metaphor, from perfectly sealed to totally ruptured. Tier 1 is your smoothly flowing, fully compliant pipeline. Transparent capped fees, perfect records, the whole shebang. But contrast that with Tier 2, the gray zone. Paul notes these are mostly just under-resourced practices. Think of a small volunteer rescue that falls behind on paperwork during a massive transport. There's zero intent to deceive here, it's driven by capacity gaps. So while it poses regulatory risks, it isn't malicious fraud.
The legal escalation really hits in Tiers 3 and 4. Tier 3 is deceptive practice. We're talking systematically overstating adoption success rates, or operating a resale pipeline. That exposes directors to major civil liability. But Tier 4? That is criminal fraud. This means soliciting donations for animals that are never actually placed, or worse, animals that are killed or abandoned. And Hospi always stresses the catastrophic reality here. When a Tier 4 rupture happens, the very animals this pipeline was built to protect end up paying the ultimate price.
Which brings us to Section 4, pipeline rupture, Miranda's rescue. Let's look at a real-world rupture.
We're going to look at a real, currently active case study to illustrate what a complete Tier 4 pipeline rupture looks like when it allegedly occurs. Now, before we proceed, I want to clearly and impartially frame the source's disclaimer. The defendant we are discussing, Shannon Miranda, has not been charged with any crime as of the June 2026 reporting we are reviewing. This is a live news matter. All allegations are exactly that,
allegations, not established facts. We're using this strictly as a reported illustration of structural vulnerability. We absolutely do not take sides here.
Based on the verified public statements from the Humboldt County Sheriff's Office, Paul laid out this timeline for us. On April 26, 2026, they received a tip alleging felony animal abuse, fraud, and conspiracy at Miranda's Rescue. Investigators served a search warrant on May 1st, and after realizing a massive number of transferred animals couldn't be accounted for, they actually served a second search warrant on June 23rd, authorizing the excavation of the property. Just really heavy, shocking stuff.
And guys, the sheer volume here is staggering. Oakland Animal Services alone reportedly sent over 800 dogs to Miranda's Rescue since 2020. That was like 13% of that shelter's total transfers. Obviously, Oakland has stopped these transfers now. But Hospi really emphasized the welfare perspective here. An entire ecosystem of dogs is just unaccounted for. And Paul pointed out that this systemic shock is exactly why we're seeing such massive multi-agency involvement. The FBI, the DOJ, the USDA. It perfectly highlights how relying entirely on self-reported outcomes without any independent verification can mask a massive Tier 4 failure for literally years.
So how do we fix it? Section 5, Red Flag Screening Framework. Let's bring this right back to executive risk management. How can shelters proactively inspect their pipelines for these critical leaks? Host B and Paul tag-teamed an incredible checklist for this. First, high volume without verifiable outcomes. If a rescue is pulling way more dogs than their facility can actually handle, red flag. Second, resistance to outcome audits. If a shelter asks to verify a dog's status and the rescue pushes back, massive red flag. Third, relying on self-reported success rates as the only metric. You'd be amazed how many shelters skip simple microchip spot checks. And Paul added the legal red flags, like charitable registry gaps, failing to file with the Attorney General, and a disproportionate reliance on transfer fees. That literally creates a structural incentive to just maximize intake for cash.
To bring it all together, Paul walked me through this cross-reference matrix to pinpoint the exact legal liability for each tier. Tier 1 conduct, zero exposure, totally compliant. Tier 2 carries civil risk but lacks fraud intent. But Tier 3, like paying breeders or overstating outcomes, that triggers Government Code Section 12580 and the loss of the AB 519 exemption. And Tier 4, collecting fees for animals you don't place or kill, that brings down Penal Code 484 for theft by false pretenses, 503 for embezzlement, and 597 for animal cruelty.
Which brings us to the ultimate takeaway from our deep dive today. This isn't just theory, right? It's actively happening in the pipes that move our most vulnerable animals. During our discussion, host B asked a question that really stuck with me. Are the cooperative agreements in our own communities built entirely on blind trust? So I'm going to leave you with this provocative thought to challenge your own transfer partnerships. Is your local shelter system unknowingly funding a Tier 4 pipeline by relying on unverified outcomes? It is time to look closer at the integrity of your own local pipelines. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and we will see you next time.